Good morning. My name is Ryan Bast of the Motor Safety Association, and today we're doing a webinar on training requirements for agricultural dealerships. I'd like to first acknowledge and thank John Schmeiser and the staff of QUIDA for really promoting and putting the information out regarding this webinar today. A couple of years ago, John and Marty Cobb, the Executive Director of Motor Safety Association, sat together and had a bit of a meeting of different ways we can work together. And one of the recommendations were offering quarterly webinars. So that's how this partnership came to be with the webinars that we're hosting every quarter for the membership of QUIDA. Today's topic, training requirements for agricultural dealerships, is actually set a record for us for the most amount of registered people that we have for one of our webinars with QUIDA, so we're quite excited about that. You may have noticed I have muted your microphone, and when we have this many people involved with the webinar call, we try to keep the feedback and background noise to a minimal. So what we'll do is we'll leave the microphones muted for the duration of the presentation. However, there is an opportunity to type your questions into the question box, and at the end of the webinar we will go through those questions and try to answer them for you, and then we will go through it in that regards. So who is the Motor Safety Association? Since there's some new people on the call here, I'll spend a little bit of time with this slide. We are a safety association in the province of Saskatchewan. So we look after any business that sells or services anything with a motor and steering wheel. So in the province of Saskatchewan, that would encompass all of the farm equipment dealerships, the car dealers, the tire dealers, the auto body dealers, the towing companies, the gas bars, bulk fuel and petroleum and propane, the rental associations, those sort of businesses would fall under our safety association. We are a non-profit, non-government association, so we would basically provide safety consulting, advice, and recommendations. We work with companies to assist them in setting up their safety programs and mentoring them in their businesses with health and safety. We work actively through claims management to return injured workers back to the job, and we do a lot of business on site with the companies such as shop inspections, we do noise level testing, ergonomic assessments, and we do safety audits such as core certification. We did actually just recently update our website last week, so we've got a lot of new things on there, so feel free to check that out at your convenience. And we're also on Twitter, so follow us on Twitter if you're on Twitter as well. So today's agenda, the items that we're going to go over in this webinar, is we're going to look at a bit of an introduction and definitions regarding training requirements. We'll touch on the CSA standard for training. We'll look at a couple of examples of different training matrices that you could use in your dealership. We'll look at the applicable training legislation for the provinces within QUIDA. And we're going to touch on some probable training areas, some areas within the business that could pose a great opportunity to complete training in. And as promised, we'll have availability to answer questions at the end of the webinar. So to start off, we're going to plant a few seeds, going to ask a few questions to get you kind of thinking about training requirements and the need for it in the industry. What safety training do I need to work at a farm equipment dealership? So if I were to ask my frontline staff and pose the question to them, what do they need for training, and go through some of the assessments, we would have a good idea of different categories and areas where people need to be trained at within the dealerships. There's so many different pieces of equipment and tools and processes that dealership personnel work with. But what about the fact that do dealership personnel receive the required safety training from post-secondary institutes? I know a lot of dealerships send their technicians and parts people to different colleges and post-secondary institutes, but do they receive all of the training that we're going to cover off in today's webinar in these categories? So that's something that you may want to consider as well, if they're receiving adequate training from these secondary institutes when it comes to safety. What about, do you complete a risk assessment with new pieces of equipment? So if you get a new model piece of equipment at your dealership that has superseded the previous model, do you take a look at that piece of equipment to determine, do I need any additional training to work on this piece of equipment? Or is there anything that's changed that's going to affect my health and safety? If is there a different mount or an extra bracket? There's something maybe different. They've done some modifications. So you're going to want to refer to your OEM procedure that's going to give you some information on that, and you may have to complete a risk assessment and a job hazard analysis to look at some of these needs when we go to different pieces of equipment. How about training? Does my training meet the legislated requirements? Well, the fact is, if there's a test involved at the end of the course, it's considered training. If there is no test, it's basically information only. For example, this webinar today is information only. But if I were to offer a test at the end of this webinar or an additional form of evaluation for competency, it would be considered training. So keep that in mind. And is my training recognized? Does it meet the regulations or standards in your province? Those are questions you can ask local trainers. If you have a company that wants to offer safety training to your business, ask them if it meets the regulations or if their training is recognized. I know in Saskatchewan, our association, we offer supervisor and occupational health committee training, and we are deemed as a recognized training agency because we've completed the Train the Trainer program that the WCB offers. So our training is recognized. So that's important when you are sending people to training to ensure that they are receiving training that is in fact recognized. And I got a quote here by Peter Drucker. If you think training is expensive, try ignorance. And I think what Peter's getting at, he realizes there is a time and cost investment to provide training. But however, the consequences of not being aware of how to do your job will far outweigh any training costs. So those are a little bit of things as far as an introduction to get us really thinking about this topic, training requirements in agricultural dealerships. So we do have a CSA standard when it comes to training standards within health and safety. And the definition by training through this CSA standard is any structured activity with measurable outcomes provided to trainees to gain, improve, or retain specified knowledge, skills, and abilities or influence attitude. When I look at this definition, I bolded and underlined measurable outcomes. So according to the CSA standard, in order for training to be, in order for an item to be deemed as training, you need to have a test or some sort of measurable outcomes or a way of recognizing competency. Otherwise, it's just information. So that comes right out of the CSA standard, that definition of training. I want to talk a little bit about some of the benefits of training. If people are trained how to do their job safely, they will know about the hazards and they will be more efficient. Supervisors can then spend less time correcting mistakes if workers are not trained how to do their job correctly. So if someone's not trained how to do that piece of equipment they're servicing to do that task correctly, that's when we see the need that supervisors are spending time correcting some of these mistakes. It factors into health and safety if people aren't working in the safest possible fashion. And I know dealerships, they can't afford to chance employee development to trial and error. You just can't get someone working on a piece of equipment and get them to try it and hope that they do it correct the first time. So there is a benefit of training by increasing the efficiency. People are aware of the hazards, they can work safe, and we're going to be doing it efficient the first time. I was reading in a journal about some information regarding research they've done about training, and studies indicate that training in safety, work methods, and job hazard procedures will significantly reduce incident costs. So a good way of bringing your WCB costs down and keeping your workers on the job and not injured are having them trained effectively so that they are going to be working safely. And those are some key benefits of training within your dealership. I want to touch on a 6-step training system. This could help you set up a training program or model in your dealership. And the first step is determining your training needs. So with that, you would make a list of what training a technician or parts person or dealer personnel needs to do their job safely. So you can do that research, compile that list to determine what tasks that they're going to be working on. Then you can set your training objectives, and that is essentially, what do we want our learners to learn as an objective? Are we going to use current legislation as the background for this objective, or the content of the operator's manual? Is that going to be our objective for this course that we're looking for? And then we will figure out, how are we going to meet these training objectives? Are we going to utilize an instructor-guided classroom learning environment? Or are we going to use online or e-learning? And then secure and develop the program. So is there currently already a training program out there for our needs? Or do we have to develop our own program and train our own trainers and have that training recognized? And then we're going to complete that training, have that training completed using proficiency tests and issue certificates. By doing all these things, it allows us to evaluate and follow up our training to see, in fact, were our objectives met? Can we improve our safety training modules in the future? You can use evaluation feedbacks as a tool to gain that information. So I'm hoping this here 6-step model will help you determine what your training needs are in your dealership, how you plan to get those needs fulfilled, and to follow up to see that those needs are working and that people are meeting that training standard. I have a couple of examples in the next few slides. This is what a service technician training matrix may look like. You can utilize something like this in your dealership. Your list may be longer than this, it may be shorter than this, depending what sort of safety training requirements and or equipment or processes you have at your dealership. So you can see that there's timelines in place. So if someone is going to be not working with the overhead crane until after the first week, you can push that training to the first week. So feel free to utilize some sort of training matrix like this and to set your objectives in it for the timeline that you want the person to complete that training in, and or with the courses that he or she may require as part of the training at your dealership. I also have a similar example for parts, and keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, this is just an example. Your list may vary at your dealership, so feel free to utilize something like this or to add anything that you require for your training needs at your dealership. There's legislation in place that focuses on training. And I had the pleasure of actually researching through the BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba health and safety regulations for training. And what was kind of neat was I went through the PDF search function on each of these 4 documents, and I typed in the word training. And I was quite surprised at how often the word training was mentioned in each of those pieces of legislation. So in the next 4 slides, I've highlighted training in each of those 4 provinces, which are applicable to CWIDA. But I encourage you to review the regulations for your own province or jurisdiction to confirm those training legislation, because what I'm going to show you in the next few slides is just a sampling of what was mentioned in their legislation. So to ensure that you meet the requirement, I encourage you to look a little further into that training legislation. But what I will give you will definitely give you a good foundation of what the training requirements are. For example, in British Columbia, every employer must provide to the employer's workers the information, instruction, training, and supervision necessary to ensure the health and safety of those workers in carrying out their work and to ensure the health and safety of other workers at the workplace. That comes out of Regulation 115, out of the BC document. And this states very clearly that the employer's workers need the information, instruction, and training and supervision. So it quite itemizes those training requirements for the province of British Columbia. In the Alberta document for training legislation, actually I pulled a sampling on this one pertinent to equipment. And this comes from Regulation 15, subsection 1. An employer must ensure that a worker is trained in the safe operation of the equipment the worker is required to operate. An employer must ensure that the training referred to in subsection 1 includes the selection of the equipment, limitations, pre-use, the use, operator skills required by the manufacturer's specifications. So this regulation speaks to using the equipment safely and knowing the limitations and the pre-use inspections of the equipment. So their regulation clearly outlines what those training requirements are for equipment in Alberta. In Saskatchewan, an employer shall ensure that a worker is trained in all matters that are necessary to protect the health and safety of the worker when the worker begins work at a place of employment or is moved from one work activity or work site to another that differs with respects to hazards, facilities, or procedures. Which this actually quite closely mirrors the Manitoba's training legislation that comes out of their Act 4, subsection 4. Every employer shall provide information, instruction, and training to a worker to ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, the safety and health of the worker before the worker begins performing a work activity at a workplace, performs a different work activity than the worker was originally trained to perform, or is moved to another area of the workplace or a different workplace that has different facilities, procedures, or hazards. So as you can see, amongst the 4 provinces, they do have clear legislation in place that people do need to be trained for their duties as well as operating the equipment. And this is important that this structure is outlined for training requirements, because now that we know that there are training requirements in place that people are legislated to be trained. These next few slides, we're going to look at some probable areas where people should be trained, and these are only if they are applicable at your dealership. So if you have some of the equipment, these machines or practices in the next slides that we're going to feature, you're going to want to ensure that your staff are trained in these key areas. And keep in mind as well, your training should not be limited to what you see in these next few slides. These are just going to be some examples of some probable areas where training should be looked at in your dealership. And in no particular random order, aerial work platforms. Do you utilize these in your dealership? If so, training needs to include what the manufacturer's instructions are for the proper use and controls of this piece of equipment, what its limitations are, the terrain that it can go through. And the operator's manual does cover off a lot of this key information. Also with aerial work platforms, you are required to wear fall protection, and there's a little anchorage point inside of this aerial work platform basket, and never to drive this when it's elevated. So if you use or have staff that use aerial work platforms in your dealership, you're going to want to ensure that they receive training on how to use this machine safely. The same goes for overhead cranes. And actually in Saskatchewan, we're quite fortunate. Table 16 at the back of the regulations, it states what the legislated training requirements are. It tells us that the people need to be trained on the safe use of cranes, the types of cranes, how to control it, operate it, the signaling, the maintenance. So the table clearly outlines in Saskatchewan what the training requirements are for overhead crane. Didn't look at the other provinces, I do apologize, but I do mention what Saskatchewan focuses on in their table. You do want to be aware of, again, the crane capacity so that you're not overloading these cranes, where the shutoff switch is in case of an emergency, and the travel of the crane along the rail so that you're not hitting anything, and to ensure that you're conducting pre-shift inspections of the overhead crane. So what goes with overhead cranes? Rigging. And again, with rigging, as a component of overhead crane usage, and you may use rigging through other places within your dealership, you want to ensure you're using the correct rigging for the correct application. And there is training around rigging. You want to ensure that you inspect your rigging before use to ensure that it's safe to do so. You're using the correct rigging for the job that you're using it for, and that you're storing your rigging properly. So there are some clear outlines regarding rigging that people should be aware of when it comes to training requirements. How about powered mobile equipment? I know when we spoke about the Alberta legislation, it clearly stated that people need to know how to operate pieces of equipment. And again, in Saskatchewan, what they did in 2007, they outlined powered mobile equipment training. They featured it, and they outlined clear training requirements that operators need to have either 16 hours of documented training per piece of equipment, or they could be grandfathered as competent operators in Saskatchewan. So when we're looking at different pieces of equipment, it recognizes people needing to receive powered mobile equipment training in items such as sprayers, forklifts, combines, two-wheel drive tractors, four-wheel drive tractors. They just can't have training in one of those areas. So if these people operate more than one piece of equipment, they need to be trained in each of those areas of equipment. And something that I've seen is in my discussions with another farm equipment dealership, when they told me how they were addressing this legislation, he says, I don't want all my operators trained on forklift because I want maybe 3 people in my dealership trained to operate the forklift. That way I know this forklift is going to be operated only by those 3 trained competent operators, and they're going to inspect it, and they're going to do the pre-shift inspections on those forklifts, and they're going to operate them safely because I'm going to have just those 3 people doing it. His exact words were, why do I want everybody and anybody jumping on a forklift in our dealership? So that was a direction that this group decided to adapt. And the same thing you could look at for your pieces of equipment to ensure that people do receive training in each of those styles or pieces of equipment to ensure that they're a competent operator. Fall protection is another area that we look to with specific training requirements. You may recall from a webinar that we've done a few months ago on fall protection. And I encourage you to refer back to that webinar because in that webinar I clearly outlined for all the provinces within CUIDA what the legislation is for fall protection. To make a long story short, each province does have requirements for fall protection. And there are issues and concerns when it comes to fall protection. This webinar that we've done previously covers off a lot of those key areas. So I do encourage you to look at that webinar. Sometimes people think of, when they think of fall protection, it automatically means putting on a body harness and a lanyard with a shock absorber. That's a component of, that's fall arrest pertaining to fall protection, but there's also a hierarchy. We can maybe look at the elimination or the possibility, a reduction of people falling. Say, for example, on this air cart, where on the staircase they added a rail and a safety barrier railing on top. So those are different hierarchies of fall protection. And I know within Saskatchewan, for legislation, there's been a lot of ticketing going on for lack of fall protection. And this is an area that a lot of people sometimes may find challenging with different areas. Where do we tie off in our shop? Where do we tie off on the piece of equipment? And on that previous webinar, we do cover a lot of that information for training requirements with fall protection. So I encourage you to take a look at that at your convenience. When it comes to ergonomics, there again too is legislation in place that states any workers who engage in lifting, handling, or holding loads receive appropriate training. And actually all the provinces have legislation in place about ergonomics and people working smarter, not harder. That essentially is the definition of ergonomics, fitting that work to the worker. And when we look at ergonomics within this industry, it makes up 27% of the total number of incidents come from ergonomics, which is 53% of all the financial costs due to claims come from ergonomic injuries, such as a hand injury, a back injury, shoulder injury. Those are all related to ergonomics. Sometimes people think of ergonomics as sitting at a workstation or a computer desk and working in an office environment. That is a component of ergonomics. But what I'm speaking of is industrial ergonomics, what we see in these pictures. For example, the gentleman on the left, this was featured in the Western Producer. It's a farmer from Brandon, Manitoba, who came up with this hydraulic scoop that allows him to lift his bags of canola seeds to the top of his air cart. So there's an example of working smarter, not harder. Or the picture on the right, where our association partnered with a local dealership and came up with a solution and a scenario to removing concaves from rotary combines using an electric winch. And we do have that case study and Prairie Farm Report video on our homepage of our website. So I encourage you to look at that. And we do see a lot of ergonomic concerns when we go to dealerships. Sometimes I'll go into a parts department and I'll see batteries way high on the top shelf. And those are a back and shoulder injury waiting to happen when people are trying to remove those batteries from those bins that they have them stored very high. So taking a look at those processes, ensuring people are trained on how to be aware of ergonomics. We in Saskatchewan have a half-day ergonomic workshop that we offer, as well as on our website. We did a webinar for CUIDA last year, which looks at ergonomics in agricultural dealerships. So I encourage you to also look at that, which it speaks about the training requirements for ergonomics. How about driving and pulling a trailer? If you have a driver's license, that doesn't mean you know how to pull a trailer, hook onto a trailer, or back up a trailer. And look at your own dealership. Is this something that people do? Do people drive or trailer? What about transferring parts between locations? Sometimes you may have a junior employee who just has their license, or a very young worker who's asked to hook onto a trailer and load up some parts and transfer them to another location. Has that employee received training on rigging to tie that load down properly? Do they know how to handle that trailer in different road conditions for the different weather conditions we're exposed to? People need, that is a training requirement if this is something that they do in the business. Also, when you're trailering equipment, Say, for example, a header transport or different implements, they sometimes have a maximum speed decal right on the drawbar. So if you are towing a unit, ensure that you look at that limit and follow that limit. Also, a lot of implement tires have a speed limit right on those tires so that you know that you don't exceed that limit. And keep in mind you're using the correct rigging and truck for the job. You want to use the correct draw pin, ensure your safety chains are in place, and you don't want to hook a quarter-ton truck onto a round baler or a small cultivator and pull it down the road. So you want to ensure that people are trained adequately for this role in the business, and sometimes this area gets overlooked. So I encourage people to focus on this if this is something that is conducted at your dealership. What about your customers? Do you train your customers on a piece of equipment, how to operate it, that they purchase from your dealership? I can think of an example. When I worked at a dealership, there was a customer who used to use a pull-type swather and ended up buying a self-propelled swather with a 30-foot header on it. And as he was leaving the parking lot, he hit 6 different vehicles and caused damage to all of those vehicles. So this was an example of this customer didn't know how to operate that piece of equipment. He wasn't trained how to do that safely. Actually, I know some colleges offer agriculture operator courses. I was on CUITA's website this morning and I seen a link for agriculture operator courses. So that may be something you may want to promote to your customers to ensure that they know how to operate equipment safely. Lockout, tagout. Again, that was another webinar we did in January of this year. And in that webinar, there are specific training requirements for all the provinces within CUITA requiring the usage of a lockout tagout procedure. So I encourage you to go back in that webinar because it clearly outlines that you are required to utilize lockout tagout within your dealership and to make sure it's in place. Lockout tagout is essentially isolating the machine's energy from being released unexpectedly. So when this machine is locked out, it can't be driven, the hydraulics can't be released, and the pressure is going to drop on it and the loader is going to come down. So there needs to be a lockout tagout procedure in place. And again, I encourage you to refer back to our previous webinar that highlights in detail the lockout tagout requirements for equipment and some different examples within dealerships that they can utilize. What about your safety committee? So if you have dealer personnel on your safety committee, have they received training to be on your safety committee? I know in Saskatchewan, the committee co-chairs, they both require level 1 and level 2 committee training. However, I'm an advocate for anyone on the safety committee should receive committee training to be trained on how to be the best person they can be on that committee to fulfill their duties. On our website, we have Level 2 online committee training, which anyone from any province can take. This is recognized training put out by the Canadian Centre of Occupational Health and Safety. They do charge you $10 to take an inspection course and another $10 to take an investigation course, but these are approved, recognized courses that people can take, and we do have the link on our website that gives you information to those courses. How about WHMIS? Are people in your dealership trained on WHMIS for the areas that are specific to them in their dealership? When we look at these symbols for WHMIS, do we have any of these products within our dealerships? And I say yes, after we know that we see these products within businesses, the compressed gas, flammable materials, poisonous, corrosive, a lot of these things that we do see. For example, what if a customer brings a sprayer in and there's chemicals still in it and they want the technician to work on it? Was that technician trained on WHMIS? Did they receive WHMIS training? Or if a customer brings in a sealed plastic bag with sprayer fittings and they're full of some sort of chemical, what chemical is that? Did that parts person receive WHMIS training? There's a lot of things within the dealership, such as solvents and different cleaners, that people need to receive WHMIS training on. Again, we do have a link to the WHMIS training course on our website, one through the Canadian Centre of Occupational Health and Safety, and we do have other packages for online courses which do give you some good access to training. There's also a safe handling course that specifies on chemical safety, which may be something that you may want to look into as well. So keep those things in mind, that people need to be trained in WHMIS. What about transportation of dangerous goods? A lot of times people may think of TDG as it's just applicable to transport companies. But if you ship dangerous goods or transport them, you need TDG training. So if you're a shipper, you need to be trained and know how to complete the appropriate documentation for transportation of dangerous goods, the classification of the product you're shipping, and how to label packages. So keep in mind, this isn't just for the transport companies, but if you're shipping, handling, or preparing these goods, you need to be trained and certified in transportation of dangerous goods. Personal protective equipment. Sometimes we see at dealerships where they may have a area where they supply hearing protection or eye protection. It's great that those things are out there, but people need to be trained on how to use their personal protective equipment, store it, maintain it, and clean it. You'd be surprised how many times I see foam earplugs that aren't installed correctly. Sometimes they're installed backwards, or they're not pressed into the ear, that they're just about falling out. So that tells me those people weren't trained on how to use personal protective equipment. Or I'll see a respirator sitting on a toolbox that's not sealed in a plastic bag or out of the elements. So people need training through personal protective equipment, whether it be through orientation. There's a lot of good training courses that talk about personal protective equipment. We just can't supply it and think people know how to use it. We have to ensure that people are trained on how to use personal protective equipment. I know a lot of dealerships are doing a good job with this through their orientation. They have a section that they train people on pertinent to personal protective equipment. I'm going to touch a little bit on emergency response. First aid. So in your dealership, do you have trained people who are first aid attendants? Legislation states the requirements for first aid attendants. So it depends on how many staff you have, the distance to your nearest medical facility, and that determines how many trained people you need and to what level of training they need in first aid. Actually, something I seen that was pretty cool at another dealership, they had a crest with a red cross stitched on their coveralls on the shoulder. So anybody could view and see who is a trained first aid attendant. So they had the information posted on their safety bulletin board, but they also had that Red Cross crest etched on the coverall. So I thought that was really neat as a good visual reminder of who the first aid attendant was. So keep in mind there are requirements to have first aid attendants trained at your dealership. What about AEDs? Automated external defibrillators. We're seeing a lot of these pop up at different dealerships. You see them in the malls, you see them in the rinks. People, when you have these in place at your dealership, they need to be trained on how to use those. And I do admit the AEDs, some of them, they have a self-instruction module that will give you some good information on how to use the AED, but having people trained on the correct AED usage is critical. And I'll share with you a story why. Some time ago, I responded to a situation where a patient was in cardiac arrest, and he was between the wall and his bed on the floor of his bedroom. So I hooked on the defibrillator, and keep in mind space is limited as is access, and when I delivered that shock to that person through the defibrillator, his body came off the ground about 6 inches and nearly made contact with me. So if that would have happened, that shock would have been transferred over to me, which could have been quite fatal. So I always keep that in mind, that when we see these defibrillators out in the public and in areas within our dealerships, people need to be trained. Share my story if you want to, but I just really strongly advocate that people receive proper training when it comes to defibrillators, because you could also be harmed when you're trying to save somebody. And fire extinguishers. Keep in mind, fire extinguishers, people should be trained on how to use them. For example, I like to recommend the pass system, where you pull the pin, aim the hose, squeeze the trigger, and sweep it at the base of the fire. So there are training requirements that people could utilize when it comes to fire extinguishers, because everyone has extinguishers in their dealership. Some things you can also train people on for fire extinguishers are that they are required to be inspected monthly in-house as per the National Fire Code. So they do require you to do a visual inspection on those extinguishers, where you take them off the wall, upside down, you set them, tap them with a mallet to excite the molecules, you ensure that they're clean, the pin is in, the gauge is fully charged, and in fact it's on the bracket where it's supposed to be. These are things that people could be trained on when it comes to fire extinguishers within the dealership. Like I said, a lot of these things we take for granted. People know how to use extinguishers and defibrillators, but there's really a lot of good information that people could be trained on when it comes to the operation of those pieces of equipment. How about supervisors? The duty of the employer is to ensure supervisors are trained. So supervisors should take some sort of a safety course. We offer a half-day supervisor course, which covers inspections, investigations, job hazard analysis, and risk assessment, and which all those topics I just mentioned, we also have webinars on those on our website that we've done for QITA. Actually, the JHA webinar I just looked at yesterday, we had over 2,300 views on YouTube on that webinar. So people are utilizing this information. So keep in mind, supervisors should take those courses and be trained for what their duties are for health and safety. And I mentioned earlier, they can take online courses that covers that information off for them. For some of the information for inspections, investigations. So just keep in mind, as a training requirement, supervisors need to be trained for their safety responsibilities. I want to wrap up by talking about something that we rolled out in Saskatchewan called the Competent Safety Leader. And we felt the need to work with businesses and memberships that they have a competent safety leader within their dealership or business that has the basic knowledge and interest and for health and safety, where they can encourage and help others within their location. We feel this is critical because sometimes in a multiple dealer group, they've got someone in head office who's very good with health and safety, but maybe the other stores don't have that safety champion or that competent safety leader. So we put a little criteria out, which we do have on our website, where people have to complete 7 different courses, and there's a little bit of homework involved for them to become competent safety leaders. So I encourage people in Saskatchewan to take us up on that, because having that safety champion or promoter in your workplace and in your different locations is going to do very good for you, as far as having people trained and having that information present by having a leader on staff in each of those locations. This concludes our presentation this morning for training requirements for agricultural dealerships. We do have, I'll leave our phone numbers on the slide, as is my email address on the slide. I'm going to look at the question box shortly, but what I want to mention is we are looking for topics from you folks for future webinars. We have October 15th marked as the next webinar date, but we want to make these webinars the best that they can be for your benefit. So please feel free to give us suggested topics so we can design webinars for your for this group. After the conclusion of this webinar, you will also have the opportunity to complete a brief evaluation feedback survey, and that helps us with continuous improvement to give you guys the best possible webinars we can in the future. So with that, I will check to see if there's any questions, and as mentioned, people can feel free to contact us at any time with any questions. So we did have one question today, which is a great question. Will we have access to this slide on the QITA website, or can this be sent to us? Great question, and the answer is yes. Next week we will have this webinar uploaded to our website, and I will send a copy to QITA, and so feel free to utilize that information. So this webinar, as well as all of our other webinars, we have posted online, so feel free to utilize those at any time. So with that, that looks like that is all of our questions that we received today. Thank you guys for attending this webinar, and I encourage you to fill out the evaluation for this webinar today. Thank you.